so delighted to be here amidst all of you. I want to start by congratulating each and thanking each and every single one of you who is here today as a student and therefore community leader for free speech, for due process, for all of the fundamental freedoms to which FIRE and the ACLU are both neutrally committed to defending and promoting in a nonpartisan manner. And for all of the reasons that Robert said, unfortunately, as our society has become more and more polarized, we find too many people and too many organizations are rather result-oriented and selective in their support for and defense of values that I and FIRE and the ACLU profoundly believe have to be neutrally and even-handedly defended, even, indeed, especially for people with whose ideas we strongly disagree. And all of this used to be much more widely accepted, I think, and as somebody who thrives on debate and discussion and dissent, I welcome the opportunity to debate and dissent on these issues. But it's also nice to know that I'm in a room where there's a lot of concurrence on at least that fundamental principle. I assume that we have a lot of ideological diversity. I hope we have a lot of ideological diversity on other grounds. Before leaping into the substantive topic of my talk, I did want to spend a moment to talk about having been active in these endeavors for many decades. What is so uniquely satisfying in both a professional sense and a personal sense from being involved in a neutral, nonpartisan defense of fundamental freedoms. First of all, in terms of effectiveness, and this is one of the reasons why FIRE as a relatively young organization has such an admirable and influential track record, why the ACLU as a much older organization, we're about to celebrate our 100th anniversary next year, also has a very solid track record of achievement, is you can get a lot more done if you are willing to collaborate on particular issues that you agree on with other individuals and organizations and politicians, even if you strongly disagree on other issues. Now, that might sound just like common sense, but I have to tell you, especially in this polarized and fragmented society, we are finding more and more people and officials and organizations who are applying increasingly demanding litmus tests. And if you don't agree with me on 100% and every jot and tittle and every iota of every detail, well, I'm just not going to work with you. And that is something that has, I think, regretfully stopped a lot of progress on a lot of important issues. I want to give you an example from today's New York Times. I could give you an example from just about every day. And I know that you were so busy with the wonderful program here that you probably didn't have a chance to read it. But it's an op-ed that was written by the, until recently, head of Planned Parenthood, Leanna S. Wen, a physician who was forced out of Planned Parenthood about the day before. And she writes this op-ed about why she left. And regardless of what your views are on abortion or reproductive freedom or Planned Parenthood, she's making a larger point here. It happens to be an issue that I care passionately about on the merits as well, but I would be distressed regardless of what my views are on the issues. I'm just going to read you a couple paragraphs, and I commend the whole thing to you. She says, perhaps the greatest area of tension between herself and the board was over our work to be inclusive of those with nuanced views about abortion. I reached out to people who wrestle with abortion's moral complexities, but who will speak out against government interference in personal medical decisions. I engaged those who identify as being pro-life, but who support safe, legal abortion access because they don't want women to die from back alley abortions. I even worked with people who oppose abortion but support Planned Parenthood because of the preventive services we provide. We share the desire to reduce the need for abortion through sex education and birth control. There were early signs that this approach galvanized new allies and was moving the needle on public perception. Despite many shocking laws passed this year, and here's a fact that I think is dramatically underpublicized. Very few, we know about all of the new restrictions on abortion that are designed to conflict with Roe versus Wade, bring a test case to the Supreme Court. But how many people know that more legislation to protect abortion access passed in 2019 than in any year in recent history? An NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll last month showed that support for Roe versus Wade was at the highest point in 4 decades. In other words, almost since Roe versus Wade was decided. So all of that reaching out to people who had nuanced views on abortion, she says, is what got her kicked out of her leadership position. Ultimately, my departure is not about me or the organization, and she continues to speak very highly of it. The organization I continue to care deeply about. It goes beyond the movement for reproductive rights to the very ethos of our country. Can we put aside partisan differences to do what is best for the people we serve? Will the conversation continue to be dominated by a vocal minority from both ends of the spectrum? Or can there be space for those of us in the middle to come together around shared values? I hope so. We need to stop treating those whose views differ from our own with scorn and suspicion, and instead work together to safeguard our health, our rights, and our future. And I agree with her that much concerned as I am about reproductive freedom and health and all the other issues at stake here, I am very concerned about the larger issue of addressing every concern for our society, all of the hot button issues, not descending into polarized camps and echo chambers. So that's the professional pitch, and why the ACLU, because we've been able to work on particular issues with, people completely across the political spectrum, people and government officials with whom we strongly disagree on some issues, we decided, I know FIRE is the same way, if on a particular issue they agree with us and they can open doors and help us to persuade people, given their connections, we will gladly work with them. And that is a key to effectively advocating the issues that you care about. So that's the professional part of it. The personal part of it, which is also really important for all of you young people embarking on what I truly, truly hope and expect will be wonderfully enriching and happy lives in a personal sense, as well as fulfilling and successful in a professional sense. There is so much joy and interest in making friends with people who are diverse and different from us in every sense. I think we all know it, and there's a lot of information and encouragement on our campuses about interacting with and becoming friendly with and collaborating with people who are different in terms of ethnic background and economic background and demographic factors. The exact same thing is true for people with whom we disagree in terms of even, dare I say, especially our most profound beliefs. And I can say that my most profound beliefs, I've already made clear, are about individual freedom, and I very much have treasured strong relationships and friendships with people with whom I strongly disagree. Robert's, even on those issues, Robert's kind introduction mentioned the fact fact that I don't know how much the names mean to you, but the 3 Supreme Court justices who were so kind as to take time from their extremely busy schedules right at the end of a very busy Supreme Court term to come and pay tribute to me as I stepped down from the ACLU were ideologically extremely diverse. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a leading member of the liberal camp, David Souter very much in the center, and Scalia very much at the opposite end from Ginsburg as an arch conservative. All 3 of them were very good friends of mine. Scalia in particular, I like to say we had a very strong friendship and mutual respect, not despite our disagreements, but precisely because of them. We first met each other when we were invited to debate each other, and we ended up debating each other all over the world, and that gave us an opportunity to not only continue to explore and agree to disagree about our differences, but also to understand the points of commonality. There is nobody with whom you will not share some very strong common interests and common values if you take the time to explore deeply enough. And that becomes a source of a lot of fun, a lot of education, and a lot of inspiration. So that's my pitch to all of you in general. Okay, now to turn to the topic of my book. I know I compared notes with my longtime friend and colleague Randy Kennedy, whom you had the great privilege of hearing from last night. And I know that we have talked a lot about these issues. By the way, all of his books are wonderful. I was reading The One Who Dare Not Speak Its Name as I was rereading it as I was coming here today. It continues to be highly relevant. I strongly recommend that. I also strongly recommend a Fire podcast that was done of Randy last summer by Nico Perino, who does the Fire podcast series, Speaking Freely. And it truly was so riveting that I pulled aside, it wasn't even a driveway moment, it was a highway moment. I pulled aside to listen to it, and then I got the transcript. So I highly, highly recommend that. And I know that part of what I'm going to say overlaps with part of the remarks that he made. But let me tell you a little bit about what drove me to write this book and why I'm a little bit hoarse, because I'm continuing to talk about its themes even more than a year since the book came out, because the topic continues to be of such burning interest and such urgency, not only all over this country, but in many foreign countries as well. So there are 4 basic points that I would like to briefly cover, but I'm now looking at my official censor over here, okay, because we decided that we want to be sure to leave 20 minutes for your questions and comments, and as a free speech believer, that's really, really important to me. So I will emphasis on brevity. There are 4 points that I'm going to briefly go over, and then without whatever remaining time that I have, I will elaborate on 1 or more of them. So the first 3 points have nothing to do with the First Amendment or constitutional law at all. They're purely policy concerns that resonate with First Amendment and indeed universal human rights and free speech principles. But they're independent policy points. And the first one is a point that I know Randy discussed yesterday, but it is so important because it is so deeply and widely challenged in our society. And that is that despite all of the assertions that there is some inherent tension between liberty and equality, between civil rights and civil liberties. I'm absolutely convinced, based on studying evidence throughout history and around the world, that by and large, these 2 values are mutually reinforcing. We do not and should not have to choose between free speech and all of the other values that are asserted to be promoted by censoring so-called hate speech. And these other values I am equally passionately committed to as I am to free speech and democracy, equality, dignity, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony, individual mental well-being and physical well-being. All of these goals, in the long run, by and large, are mutually reinforcing, and freedom of speech that is sufficiently robust to extend even to ideas that are seen as hateful or hated is an essential engine for promoting all of those other values. That's point number one. Point number two is that well-intended as censorship of hate speech is, and I don't at all question the motives of people who advocate it. As I say, I share their goals profoundly, but I profoundly disagree that this is an appropriate method for promoting those goals. To the contrary, evidence that I have deeply immersed myself in and continue to follow every day continues to show that laws censoring hate speech are at best ineffective in promoting those wonderfully important goals, and at worst counterproductive. They end up doing more harm than good. So that's the bad news, but the third point is the good news, which is that freedom of speech and raising our voices to denounce hateful ideas, to educate, to persuade, to redeem the hate mongers, all of these different strategies of using what lawyers call counter speech are actually more effective than censorship. And all three of those points overall have led to persuade not only me, I mean, that's not surprising, I've taken this position forever, although I do have to say, let me interject, to the best of my ability, when I started writing this book several years ago, I tried to approach the task open-mindedly. I had in mind a question that is the title of a book that a friend of mine is in the process of writing. He gave me permission to quote the title of the book, but he said, well, that's really putting pressure on me to actually write the book. But the title itself is really good, and I think so I like to say it and hold it in mind. What would it take to change your mind? Think about that. What would it take to change your mind? And unless you're talking about a matter of religious faith, I think you have to have an answer to that question for every issue that you approach. And so for me, if I were convinced that censoring hate speech was really essential and effective in bringing about an end or a substantial reduction in hatred and discrimination and stereotyping, I would favor it. And by the way, for those of you who haven't yet studied constitutional law, which is probably just about everybody in this room, that is the standard that the First Amendment itself embodies, right? Freedom of speech is not absolute, and a restriction on free speech is constitutionally permissible under the First Amendment if the government can show that the restriction is necessary to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance. And surely equality and dignity, these are values that are commensurate with freedom of speech. So I did approach it, the investigation, open-mindedly, and saw evidence from around the world, so many other countries that have these hate speech laws, so many social media companies that are enforcing their own anti-hate speech norms. The patterns are overwhelming and not surprising, that disproportionately these laws are enforced to silence dissent, to silence anybody who is challenging the status quo, anybody who is seeking law reform, and most tragically and most ironically, disproportionately to silence the voices of the very minority groups that were intended to be protected and empowered by the laws. We see it, the most pressing example that most of us are aware of in this country is how the social media companies are enforcing their hate speech laws. And, you know, the examples are legion. Just this month, Twitter started enforcing a new law on hate speech against white nationalists and it's YouTube. I've got another example from Twitter. Last month, YouTube announced that it was going to block material about white nationalism and anti-Semitism and fascism. And among the very first videos that were suppressed were materials from an organization in Britain that full-time is opposing anti-Semitism. And also among the first materials that were blocked were clips from archival footage from the BBC and other mainstream media companies that school teachers in Britain were using to teach their students about the dangers of fascism. So among the first casualties of a measure that's intended to suppress fascism and anti-Semitism instead is used to suppress the voices that are challenging that. How's my time coming? Okay, so I'm now going to quickly say something about point number 4, which is the First Amendment, because everything I've said so far is independent of the First Amendment. In fact, even before I segue to the First Amendment, one of the things that I found positively surprising, I mean, I was not surprised, and I was disheartened to learn that all of the accumulated evidence about the enforcement of hate speech laws in other countries and on social media were having a negative impact on equality as well as on free speech. But one of the surprising things that I learned was because the United States is so often denounced as being exceptionalist in our staunch defense of free speech for hate speech, but just as in this country, we have many people who disagree with that U.S. position. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised that in other countries there are many people, including in particular human rights activists who disagree with the censorship of hate speech in their countries. And that was very surprising to me, that international human rights organizations, regional human rights organizations, domestic human rights organizations, and individual human rights activists in every country were opposing the enforcement of hate speech laws in their countries, urging that their countries move more in the direction of the United States, using counter-speech tactics, using anti-discrimination laws. Interestingly enough, a lot of the countries that criminalize hate speech do not outlaw actual discrimination or discriminatory violence, which is very interesting. I think if you really want to make a difference, you go after the root causes of the ideas, right? Through education and counter-speech, and certainly you go after the actual discriminatory conduct, and that has been the American approach, which is now being advocated by more and more human rights activists in other countries. So I quote a lot of them in my book, and also really importantly, because, you know, despite coming from a religiously despised minority, my father was a Holocaust survivor. I know I'm a white person of great privilege, so I think it's really important to quote, and my book is filled with quotes of minority group leaders in this country, as well as other countries, who specifically from the perspective, nothing to do with the First Amendment, but just in terms of what is the most effective strategy for promoting human rights and equality, have opposed censorship. So now we go to the First Amendment, and here I saw that in the wonderful program that you have. You had a couple of First Amendment tutorials this morning from some of the great staff members at FIRE, and if I read the schedule correctly, some of the teaching was done by FIRE interns, is that right? Students themselves, and I think that's wonderful. It's the best way to learn. I keep learning through my teaching. So I hope this is not going to, this will be a review, right? Because you've already been introduced to these concepts. I hope it won't be too boring a review for you. What I found after all of the decades of teaching First Amendment law in the process of writing my book, I gained a much more enhanced appreciation of it. And that happens, right? It illustrates that you, in fact, do learn through teaching by trying to simplify but not oversimplify this enormously complex body of law. I understood some big themes very clearly, which made me realize that almost at least 90% of statements you hear about hate speech and free speech, including certainly by politicians and government officials, but often even by lawyers, are incorrect. Usually you will hear one of two general categorical assertions, which are completely opposite from each other. The one thing they have in common is that they are equally wrong. So you will often hear and see signs saying, hate speech is not free speech. That's incorrect. The United States Supreme Court never has defined a category of speech in terms of its hateful or hated content and labeled it hate speech and said, therefore, it's constitutionally unprotected. So it is distinct from another concept I know you've all heard about, obscenity, which is a recognized term of law. Hate speech, I put in quotation marks throughout my book because it's not a recognized legal term. Obscenity is a label the Supreme Court has given to a specifically defined subset of sexually oriented speech if the speech in question satisfies that definition. It is deemed to be categorically unprotected by the First Amendment, excluded from the First Amendment. And the Supreme Court continues to refuse to do that with respect to hate speech. And despite all of the disagreement on this court, including on many free speech and other First Amendment issues, the court has been unanimous on this point for many decades. Now, as I say to my students, the fact that they all agree doesn't mean that they're all right. They could all be wrong, but I think it's very interesting that people who so strongly disagree on so many other issues, coming from so many different perspectives, have all unanimously arrived at this very same conclusion. In fact, the Supreme Court just in the last year and again 2 years before that had unanimously reached this conclusion. I'll tell you about the case from a couple of years ago. Factually, it's very, very interesting. It's a case called Mattal versus Tam, and it really illustrates the point that I made, and I know that Randy made as well, about the mutually reinforcing relationship between equality and empowerment of traditionally discriminated against minorities and freedom of speech. So it involved Simon Tam, an Asian American rock musician, who wanted to who did form a band with other Asian American male rock musicians, and they chose as the name of their band, trigger warning, a traditional ethnic slur against Asian Americans. Not because they wanted to demean people of their own ethnic background, but for exactly the opposite reason, to reclaim the term, to celebrate their pride, and to proclaim it to the rest of the world. So they chose the name The Slants. And it turned out that there was a provision in the U.S. Patent and Trademark Statute that prohibited trademarking a name that was disparaging or demeaning on the basis of race or ethnicity, a typical hate speech law. So Simon and his band challenged that all the way to the Supreme Court. He's got a new book that he's just come out with that I highly recommend. He's done some TED Talks, which I also highly recommend. Oh, and I highly recommend his music, which I have even gotten to dance to. So they're great musicians as well. But when the United States Supreme Court unanimously struck down that hate speech law, they were simultaneously reaffirming the power and the dignity of Simon and of the group, the ethnic group from which he came, as well as celebrating and protecting freedom of speech. That case reflects what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of our free speech jurisprudence, which is usually called viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. That government may never suppress speech solely because of disagreement with its content, its viewpoint, its message, its idea. If you hate it, if you revile it, if you fear it, the response is not censorship, but answering back, more speech. That's principle number one. Principle number two, and this I can pretty much sum up the essence of free speech law with these two principles, says, but if you move beyond the content of the speech, the message, and you look at its context, then speech with a hateful message or any other message may be suppressed and punished if, in the particular context, all of the facts and circumstances, it satisfies what we usually call the emergency principle. Not that you vaguely fear that it might possibly indirectly at some time in the future lead to harm. That's the test that we used to enforce. That's the test that's reflected in hate speech laws in other countries and in the one that got struck down in Simon's case. And that's why every crusader for social justice, including MLK and the abolitionists before that, and the suffragists before that, and gay rights activists after that, have been punished. That's why MLK wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. So in no coincidence that in the context of the civil rights movement, as I'm sure Randy explained, the Supreme Court adopted this much stricter emergency test that demands a tight and direct causal connection between the speech and some imminent, serious harm. And the only way to prevent the harm is to punish the speech. Now, that is an appropriately strict standard, but I'm sorry to say, there is a lot of speech, including speech with a hateful message, that does actually satisfy that standard. And the Supreme Court has carved out several subcategories that will satisfy the emergency test. One is called a true threat. One is called intentional incitement of imminent violence. Another one is targeted harassment or bullying. And I give some examples in my book, but 99% of the time when people say, oh, the United States ought to protect, ought to punish more hate speech, 99% of the time the examples they give are already punishable under our law. Let me give you one example from campus that's very distressing and depressing. Washington University, American University in Washington, D.C., guess a couple of years ago now, had elected its first African-American female, first African-American woman as student body president, Taylor Dumpson. And the day that she was going to take office, be sworn in, strewn around campus were a number of bananas in nooses. And to make it even worse, written on the banana were the initials of her sorority, which is a primarily African American sorority. That clearly satisfied the standard of a so-called true threat, which is, and the Supreme Court says true threat to distinguish it from the loose way that we use the word threat. I feel threatened that YAF and Yale have tabling on my campus, right? I'm sure you have had students say that. That would not cut the mustard, but a true threat that is punishable is when the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear on the part of a targeted recipient of the message, right? Not just a general proclamation, but it has to be aimed at a particular individual or small group of individuals. And reasonably, that means it's an objective test, right? Not just a particularly thin-skinned person, a sensitive so-called snowflake, but a reasonable person in that position would feel fear, then that is subject to punishment. And by the way, notice that the test does not require that the speaker intends to carry out the harm. It's sufficient that the speaker intends to instill a reasonable fear. Because if you reasonably feel fear, that's already a substantial harm that's going to curtail your freedom, including your freedom of speech. So that's just one of many examples I could give where I think that, and my book gives many other examples, our law is very sensible. It protects the speech that is most in danger of being unjustifiably censored just because we dislike the idea. That's no justification in this democracy where we debate ideas we disagree with. We don't silence them by coercion. On the other hand, where the speech can pose the greatest danger, and the most imminent danger, the speech is already subject to punishment. So I developed a much deeper respect for our law, and I truly believe that if people understood what the law is, they would be much more supportive of it. Now I have 5 minutes left, and in the 5 minutes, I'm going to focus on the positive point, which is counter speech and other non-censorial strategies. And very briefly, I want that other non-censorial strategies, we have a lot of low-hanging fruit. Yes, unlike other countries, we have for many years, better late than never, outlawed actual discrimination on many bases, but not completely, right? In much of this country, I think it's still most of this country, and certainly as far as the federal government is concerned, throughout this entire country, you may still blatantly discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity, and it does not violate the law at all. You can refuse to hire somebody, you can fire somebody, you can refuse to rent to them just on these bases. One of the reasons I go crazy at so much energy being spilled on words, recognizing how powerful words are, but I would rather start with the deeds, right? So let's finish the unfinished business of outlawing actual discriminatory conduct. And even when we do have laws that outlaw discrimination, many of them are not effectively enforced. And here's a hot button topic that in an ideologically diverse group, I'll probably have a range of opinions, but my view is that we have too many voter suppression laws that are disproportionately disenfranchising certain segments of our population, including, by the way, students. So let's continue the work on actual discriminatory conduct. What about discriminatory and hateful violence? More coverage has been given recently by very serious reporters based on interviews with law enforcement officials at every level of government, from the FBI on down to local sheriffs and local police, that we simply have not allocated resources to investigating and prosecuting and punishing domestic extremism. For various political reasons, since the 9/11 terrorist attacks, all of the funds and resources and efforts have been sucked off into so-called Islamic terrorism. And so you have FBI officials and other law enforcement saying we are starved for the resources we need to go after domestic extremists, including hate mongers and white supremacists. And the vast, vast majority of actual crimes and violence and murders in this country since the 9/11 attacks have been done by these so-called domestic terrorists, and including white supremacists. So these are urgent issues, and we should not lose sight of them. In terms of counter speech, there's just an infinite number of ways that we can use and have a moral responsibility. In my view, we all have a moral responsibility, but especially those of us who oppose censorship have a particularly great responsibility to speak out in the most effective and sustained ways that we can against any kind of hateful or discriminatory idea. Now, I think we have to be very strategic about how best to do this. And one of the points I want to make, going back to that letter from the former head of Planned Parenthood, is that morally satisfying as it might be to denounce and debate, and in some circumstances that is an appropriate strategy, but very often more can be accomplished in a more sustained way if we reach out with empathy and compassion to other human beings, and not to be empathetic toward their ideas if we think their ideas are hateful or discriminatory, but if we truly want to have a chance to persuade them, or a term that many people who are involved in these efforts use is to redeem them, to win them away from hateful ideologies, it's not going to be done certainly not going to be done by throwing them in prison, as happens in Europe, but it's also not going to be done by stigmatizing them and treating them as non-humans, as often happens in this country. There were a couple really distressing racist incidents at the University of Oklahoma in the past couple of years, and a lot of pressure on the president from students to expel students who had engaged in this racist expression. And one of the people who was interviewed was a professor who he was only the third, even older than I am, only the third African-American professor ever hired at the University of Oklahoma back in 1967. He was a close friend of Martin Luther King. He said he was African-American. He worked very closely with Martin Luther King, was friendly with him. And I loved a line in the student newspaper. This professor was arguing against expulsion, and he went back to the strategy that King and the civil rights movement had used of reconciliation and redemption. And he said, our strategy was not to excommunicate, but to communicate. And I'm very, very moved. Given what I do, I'm usually discussing on the realm of ideas to general audiences, but I have developed a great respect and gratitude for people who do the really hard work of engaging patiently, one-on-one, in extended dialogues and building relationships with people, and have even redeemed leaders of hate-monger organizations, who then in turn devote their lives, because they feel they could never make up for the harm they've done during their years of activism, but they try, by then devoting their time to redeeming others and stopping others from joining those movements. There's now a whole genre of books, from both ends, the redeemed and the redeemers, and there are a series of TED Talks. A number of them have formed together in an organization called Life After Hate. So I strongly recommend that. Am I out of time now? Because you're not holding up. I am out of time. Well, you're not a very effective censor. No, you're not a very effective protector of the free speech of the audience. So I'm just going to end with, exhorting. You are so articulate. You're so well educated. You're so committed. Your speech is going to resonate even more than that of most other people in our society. And I know that you welcome the opportunity to raise your voices through every possible medium. And I thank you in advance for doing that. And I'm going to end by quoting my favorite ACLU t-shirt. Forgive me, you're all wearing your fire t-shirts, but it says, it defends what I consider to be our most important right, and that is the right not to remain silent. Thank you very much.